Hi there, and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are you this week?
I'm doing good, Andy. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
I don't know how many healthy years left in your life you think you have. That might be a rather personal question to pose.
As many as possible.
As many as possible. Okay, well, that's a good start. This week, folks, we're taking a look at the whole area of human longevity. There might be a certain detour into the longevity of mice and
fruit flies,
certain maybe
monkeys,
marine mammals, but the main focus is human. That's where our primary concerns lie. I think we could say that safely. And to me, it's one of those areas that you can look at as being a prime motivator for huge swathes of clinical and pharmaceutical research. And you can also see it as being the last refuge of the most outrageous of pharma snake oil sales people. There's been, over the years, not just since the modern pharma industry came into being, but for centuries, there has been a whole lore about the secrets to eternal life and restoring youth. And I'm not going to go through the various folk remedies or mythologies around bathing in the blood of infants or whatever the hell. But it's a very interesting area, though, and it's an area that has attracted some very serious scientific minds and also some utopian thinkers who just think some sort of singularity event involving technology, human life, and some sort of mystical union between the two will give us eternal life, which is wonderfully explored actually in Mark O'Connell's book, To Be a Machine, published a few years ago, won the GSK Science Book Prize. Because of my dodgy-old brain, I actually can't locate my copy of it now, so I'm not able to quote from it, but I can recommend it. But that's a sidetrack, as us older folks tend to follow our way down. To me, there's always been this kind of cultural friction between the sort of utopian, we're going to live to be 150 routinely and more, and the hard, slow trench warfare of real pharmaceutical drug development, where you just inch along through no man's land, assailed by placebo effects, by off kind of regulatory barriers, by imprecise disease biology and imperfect therapeutic modalities. And yet, progress gets made slowly, but it does get made. And there's, to me, a huge, big gap between the two. And because of my own sort of professional formation is very much in the camp of the trench warfare elements of pharmaceutical development, rather than the sort of utopian tech fantasies that we'll all just kind of go to sleep in a cryogenic chamber and wake up in 200 years and it'll all be sorted. I find that stuff annoying and simplistic. I have very little patience for it, actually. Far less patience for it than Mark O'Connell had in his book. He dealt with it with great wit and with some sort of philosophical and literary brio as well, to be fair to the guy. Really good book. But what's interesting to me too, though, is that there are serious scientific efforts underway and have been for quite some time to address aging. It's a very laudable goal to improve healthy lifespan. So you're not about necessarily trying to deny death, but you are just trying to maybe ensure that the last 10 years or so of a person's life might be healthy and meaningful, rather than ones that are beset by chronic disease and slow loss of function, and be it physical or cognitive, that can make for a few miserable final years. And so that's a very laudable thing, and there's work underway. That's a very long, breezy sort of intro to the field. Your thoughts on the whole subject, Sal?
Well, I came from the other end, or one of those two ends you talk about, the seeing companies as an investor who are looking at compounds that there is some suggestion they may extend lifespan. So initially with a couple of Canadian companies, strangely, on resveratrol. You can buy it as a nutritional supplement, and there isn't clinical data out there yet, and I'm surprised about that because it was decades ago when I saw companies working on resveratrol as an anti-aging or life-prolonging drug. It's extracted from red wine, by the way. So drinking red wine.
I've extracted a lot of resveratrol over the years.
So, which explains your sprightly appearance today. But those companies that I saw decades ago on resveratrol and the anti-aging effects have not actually come to anything at all in that time. And between that time, or following that time, we've had drugs like rapamycin, which in the lab, in fruit flies, can be shown to extend their lives. And that's fine, but rapamycin or the inhibitors of mTOR are quite toxic drugs. So, as you say, hints along the way. I mean, one of the main reasons why I bullied my primary care physician into prescribing me a statin was that I read a paper that said the mortality benefit, if you like, of the statins was greater than would expected from inhibiting the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme, which is their target. So we're now thinking about things, or I'm now talking about drugs that were discovered and are available for other indications, having a longevity effect or something else. And that extends to metformin and, as we talked about before, low-dose enteric-coated aspirin. So, that's the thin end of the wedge of what we've done or what the sector has done so far in improving longevity. And these drugs are all generic, right? So
I would add to that too, flu vaccines.
Yeah.
Flu vaccines have something like a 15% mortality benefit. And it's thought to be that if you're vaccinated every year against flu, you either don't get flu or you get a milder course of disease. And that the cumulative effects of not taking the vaccine and being exposed to the flu virus has a cardiovascular impact over time that may not be measurable in any given year, but there's a cumulative effect on that end of life, towards the end of life in your latter years, that there's an accumulation. And it's a profound effect. And this has been published in, I think, in the New England Journal of Medicine or somewhere equally sort of serious and valid. So the flu vaccine is a very, very serious piece of technology now. And I think there's going to be more work done on that, especially because of the success of the COVID mRNA vaccines, I'm expecting to see improvements in the efficacy of flu vaccines in the coming decade.
And that's all interesting from one of the other papers that you provided me with on oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species, because you'd think, if you don't have an unprotected case of influenza or COVID-19 every year for 20, 30 years, then yes, there's less extraneous cellular damage outside whatever the pathogen just outside whatever your immune system is. So that sort of fits with me to the lab data on limiting absorbing reactive oxygen species that works in mice, is it? Or insects and things to extend their longevity, which is part of the issue of it's great to extend the life of a mouse. I'm sure the mice are very pleased, and I'm sure the mice health insurance companies are not very pleased, right? But, they'll pay their premiums for longer. Perhaps they are pleased. But for us humans, it doesn't actually mean that much, does it?
No, it doesn't. They're hypothesis-generating studies rather than anything else. And how do you go about replicating, if you even want to do that, those kind of studies, or how do you probe those questions? At the same time, I mean, there have been wonderful, long-running, large-scale studies going on for long periods of time. The Framingham Park study in Massachusetts, for example, deeply important. And this long predates the kind of area of fancy molecular medicine that we now inhabit, but they've produced some wonderful work. And I think that what's really useful now in this era of big data is these Mendelian randomization studies, where you can sort of do a lot of this stuff in silico without necessarily actually having to follow population for decades. You can make very clever, if they're well-structured studies, they are incredibly complex and sophisticated, but with the right kind of statistical management and all the rest of it, you can make some very interesting inferences around the influence of genetics on disease.
But you raised the issue that initially put me off the whole longevity area as an investable space, just because of how long would it take to run a clinical study and show a significant effect? How much would it cost to do that study? And then when you think of a lot of these drugs, and 10, 15 years ago, people were talking about the poly pill, which included a statin and metformin and perhaps low-dose aspirin and some other growth supplement. But there was no incentive to do that study because everything was cheap and generic. And if you did that and it proved positive, people would say, that's great, I'll just go and formulate that pill. I'll just pop down and take each individual pill that's available for pennies separately. So the commercial aspects tend to interfere with not just how long it would take to take a group of young, healthy volunteers. And I'm not talking about med students, right? Because that's a bit of an oxymoron, but young, healthy individuals, and follow them on a drug or placebo without crossover for 20, 30 years. By that time, the patent would have expired unless you're actually making more intellectual property on it. So the commercial complications of longevity are quite strange.
And at the same time, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be doing clinical trials to find out the rudiments of a long and healthy life. A very quick Google search, you'll find, actually, one website I came across, and they refer to these blue zones of areas of high human longevity. And Sardinia has the longest lived male populations. Okinawa in Japan, the women live longer there than anywhere else. A Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda, California.
And I am waiting for you to list the two cities where we live. Cormac, anytime now.
No, I'm not going to do that. It's just for completeness. Seventh-day Adventists in California, Icaria in Greece, and a place in Costa Rica called Nicoya, where you've 2 times higher probability of reaching the age of 90 than you do in the US. No, Dublin and St. Albans, I don't have the data.
But they're not in the top 5.
I would doubt it. Air pollution, stresses of urban living, unhealthy lifestyles, etc., etc., etc. But we are both living in prosperous Western societies. So the lifespan is increasing all the time. And at the same time, too, we've seen in, say, more unequal societies, such as the US, there is now a big separation. Your lifespan is really dictated by your socioeconomic status. But the point being, though, is that we know the rudiments of a healthy lifestyle. It's about diet, exercise, being rooted in community, being connected with nature, all those things.
And it doesn't necessarily come in a pill or a tablet or an injection.
Yeah. To me, the idea that aging is itself a disease, I find offensive and problematic.
Yeah.
I think it pathologizes our very existence. And aging is a complex set of processes that happen. Some are happening in parallel, some are interconnected. I would find it very hard to disentangle cause and effect here. And the idea that you can kind of in some way hack that with a couple of simple and cheap interventions, I find that problematic. And
you may not see this as valid, Cormac, but we have already. The problem we were talking about earlier on funding a clinical trial with healthy volunteers that lasts for 30 years, you don't need to do that at the moment. You find that people who are likely to succumb to whatever conditions they have at the moment, although people who are likely to live a less than maximal lifespan. For example, obesity patients, diabetic patients, and you treat them with a drug and knock me down with a feather. We've already done it. Right, we've got the GLP-1s, inhibitors, and the SGLT2 and the PCSK9s with positive cardiovascular outcome studies in high-risk individuals. But then the bit where my argument falls down is, does that mean everyone should have one? And I don't know the answer to that.
And I don't think they should, because I think that you're then getting into that whole area of polypharmacology and can be unintended, unknown interactions. I think you need to have an evidence base for interventions that you make. But one area which I would give some credence to, even though I don't think it's yet fully proven, but at a very nice time, it's actually surprising me that this is actually almost 10 years ago. It freaks me out how rapidly time starts to pass when you get a bit older. Leroy Hood had this very interesting startup called Arivale, because what Arivale was trying to do was, there was a scientific wellness company, and it was about focusing on the individual, because the idea that you're going to give a statin or an aspirin to everybody, to me, eliminates human genetic variation and other types of biological variations that I think you have to take an account of if you are trying to look at an individual's healthy journey through their life. So what they were doing was, the usual, you're going to do whole genome sequencing or exon sequencing, whatever. 2015 sequencing wasn't quite as fast as it is now, but they were going to do in-depth sequencing of the genome, proteomic studies, metabolomics, microbiome, all that stuff, blood-based biomarkers, nutrition. And the idea being was to try to do as best they could sort of an in-depth profile as a metabolic and biological imaging based as well, I suppose. I can't remember the exact ins and outs of it. But take a deep scientific dive into an individual's biological status and their nutritional status and devise what they called actionable recommendations.
So that's tailored to each individual patient, is it?
Precisely, yeah.
Right.
And it was going to cost $3,000 a year, which I didn't think was excessive. I mean, it's not cheap, but,
Yeah, well, I want to know how many years you get for that, right? So I could do my own quality.
I think it was per year was the cost, So it's the cost of a decent golf club, I suppose, or something. But it went bust. And I thought in 2015, there were sufficiently wealthy Americans who were sufficiently interested in their health to want to go for it. I mean, when people in America spend tens of thousands on their health insurance, it's a little tiny top up. And you could well imagine an insurer actually quite happily doing a copay once there was some data to kind of establish its credibility. Yeah. That went bust, but there were other ones as well, a lot of academic studies as well too. I can see the validity of that. All it is just a sort of a much more scientifically deeper equivalent of that sort of, executive health check that top business executives undergo. So that makes sense. But I think my problem with a lot of this is that all of this is kind of posited from the implied position that we all have a healthy status quo. And we don't. And some people, we still don't know what causes Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. And I saw Jeremy Paxman, the fabled former BBC newscaster and griller of recalcitrant politicians, making a submission to Downing Street for improved services and research into Parkinson's, because he has the condition and he says it makes you sometimes wish you were never born. And it's very sad to see that. And he was this, strong, very alpha male presence in the TV studio, and he's been really laid very low by this awful disease. And our progress at Parkinson's, despite the deeply noble efforts of Michael J. Fox and the foundation he established, it strikes me that we've made very little progress with Parkinson's in the last couple of decades. I mean,
it's even worse than that, Cormac. If you think, and there's a recent preprint, I think it was a paper, but not a very large population, of the effects of the GLP-1 agonists on slowing the rate of Parkinson's progression, which might be wonderful for Novo and Lilly and any other company that has a GLP-1 receptor agonist. But on the other hand, we don't know yet. I mean, okay, in patients with active Parkinson's disease, it might slow progression. Once they get to a certain stage, it's a bit like Alzheimer's disease. Do you go beyond the point where no intervention like that will work? How early do you have to start? And we go back to this, how early do you have to run these clinical trials for in order to show that if it doesn't have a obvious disease-modifying effect, or if that disease-modifying effect takes decades, then provide us the data to show that, or preventative data as well. You're going to have to show decades of data on patients who might be at high risk for Parkinson's disease, who take GLP-1s and then don't develop it in the time frame you'd expect. But it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, there are aspects of reversal of the aspects of aging that we haven't touched. And for me, that's even a longer chalk. You think of diseases that have resulted in effectively necrosis of tissue, IPF, that sort of thing. And people still talk about reversing that sort of condition. And we've talked about other genetic diseases where the metabolic buildup results in tissue damage. And it's one thing to extend a lifetime, as you said recently, but it's another thing to keep the quality of life in that period. And if you already have disease progression, then is that a different slant to the longevity focus, in that you try and recover some of that past ability or activity or metabolism that you don't now have because of a decade's progression of your disease? And that seems to me a long chalk.
Yeah. There's increasing focus on spatial biology which is a very interesting area of research. But the other dimension is temporal biology and the timescales that we operate on, dictated to by the practicalities of running trials, by investor requirements, time horizons, which isn't necessarily a good thing. I mean, obviously, if biological questions need time to be explored, they need to be given that time. And I think sometimes it's long-term population studies done by clinicians rather than by drug companies can actually yield the kind of insights that would actually have really meaningful effects on populations.
I did think you were going to talk about a time machine then, so you could go back in time to your younger self and say, don't eat that kebab or don't drink those 8 pints of beer or something.
Yeah. No, you got to do those things. It's all part of life's rich tapestry, even if you only do them once. But I suppose there is a genetic crapshoot here. Some people are genetically set up to live a long and healthy life, and some are not. And some will develop awful conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, neuromuscular conditions. Some will be genetically hardwired, and some I might call it genetically softwired, that we don't quite know, say, why ALS arises for the most part, and conditions like that. But it does hit people in their 60s and 70s, same with Parkinson's. And Alzheimer's, again, some genetic smoking guns, but the majority of cases are apparently sporadic. So those are key, and cancer obviously is another big one. And these are major diseases of aging. And there's always been efforts to tackle them. Making progress with some, or making very slow progress, if any, with others. And I do think that maybe looking at particular biological processes such as cellular senescence, and maybe at a tissue level, vascular aging, all those things are very interesting, and I salute all the scientific experts to explore them in incredible ways. There's a very long-running discovery collaboration going on between Calico Life Sciences and AbbVie, and it started in 2014, and they've had a few extensions. That's going to run to 2030. And Art Levinson, the ex-Genentech CEO, is still running it. And they're looking at things through that kind of a senescence lens. And they do have some compounds in the clinic. And I like that idea of just applying a different molecular lens to certain diseases might shed new light and come up with new mechanisms that might give benefit. But I remain very wary of the sort of libertarian, techno-utopian kind of stuff that we're going to attain a longevity, escape velocity in a couple of decades.
I heard something similar decades ago about telomere length and how you need to shorten telomere length because it gets longer as you age, and you need drugs to do that, or DNA binders to do that. And of course, it's come to nothing. So we have priorities in healthcare, and it seems that extending everyone's longevity and healthy lifespan may not be one of them unless you come up with a disease that needs addressing and can be addressed, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease at the moment. You focus on those foci of disease that are observable, may not have a genetic content, but lots of people get. And those are the ones you address. And isn't it a thought? I tend to have the analogy years ago where it was for years we went without discovering a drug that was disease modifying in Alzheimer's disease. Arguments are that there are one or two, but for years they weren't. And what patients got were symptomatic therapies. But I thought if you bring together groups of symptomatic therapies, you might actually get, in a particular disease, you might actually get a survival benefit. And isn't that what we're doing? We're focusing on diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and even ALS, to try and knock off or cut out these particular points that are big mortality deficit inducers, in the hope that the average age of the population, and that's not going to work, is it? But the average age of the population increases.
I guess that's one way of framing the aspiration, at least.
Yeah.
But as we know with Alzheimer's, I mean, we have a few approved drugs, but they're not setting the world on fire, are they?
Nope.
Just yet. And then I think we have to sort of acknowledge the words of John Maynard Keynes: in the long run, we'll all be dead. But that's fine. It's just how we get there is what we're trying to focus on. And if we can have that idea of an extended, healthy lifespan, I'm all for that. I think that's a good thing. And the pharmaceutical industry can only address aspects of that. There are many, many other dimensions involved here. So I think we need to be kind of humble about what the industry can achieve despite all the amazing science.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, is there, if that's the acronym, but it makes me want to go for a pint now. Something that most of the time I still have left.
Yeah, it's a little bit early for that, but I grant you to go for 1 pint, 3 hours.
Okay, thanks.
Until the next time, Andy.
Cheers, bye-bye.
Enjoy your pint.
I'll try.